Say they want to delay it for that. A king. This is
more
not
than
a king.
that.
You know, they're referring to me as a king. I'm not a king.
Right.
Sustainable, but that's what the number is. It's probably not, you know, it could stand, but they forced me to do that. I think we're going to do fine with China. I get along great with him. He's a very strong leader.
People gathered across the United States over the weekend, taking part in the second nationwide No Kings protest against the Trump administration. Organizers say around 2,700 events took place, nearly double the number from the first No Kings protest earlier this year.
The streets of Washington were filled with noise, color, and defiance. Homemade signs reading "No Kings" waved above the heads of thousands. Across several states, the movement had taken on a life of its own. Part protest, part reckoning. What began as frustration over tariffs, inflation, and factory closures had erupted into something deeper, a rejection of political chaos itself. Television screens showed the same image again and again. American workers marching past shuttered plants, shouting not just against prices or taxes, but against the sense that their democracy had become a stage show. At first, the White House dismissed it as another media spectacle. But markets didn't. Gold surged, the dollar slipped, and the IMF quietly revised U.S. growth forecasts downward, warning of sustained volatility driven by policy unpredictability. The No Kings revolt wasn't about royalty. It was about leadership, about a people tired of constant confrontation, tariffs that hurt their own jobs, and the feeling that every policy was another headline rather than a plan. The same week, Trump had imposed yet another round of punitive tariffs on Canadian goods, copper, auto parts, and steel, claiming it was time to protect American manufacturing once and for all. But just days later, America's automakers, still dependent on Canadian inputs, were warning Congress. The cost of protectionism was becoming unbearable. As the noise grew louder in Washington, something else was happening just across the border, something quieter, steadier. Ottawa wasn't reacting with rage, it was calculating. Behind closed doors, Mark Carney, Canada's Prime Minister and former central banker, met with his cabinet in a secure room overlooking Parliament Hill. His tone was calm, analytical. "We don't need to mirror chaos," he said. "We need to build confidence." That became Canada's unspoken strategy, not escalation, but endurance. While the US burned energy on speeches and tariffs, Canada turned its focus to structure, supply chains, mineral security, trade diversification. The irony was striking. The No Kings revolt had been born from anger at America's own leadership turmoil. And yet the result was to highlight a sharp contrast, a United States drifting into protest and populism, and a Canada that was quietly turning crisis into leverage. For the average viewer, this may seem abstract, trade flows, policy shifts, percentages, but in real lives it looked like this. In Brampton, Ontario, workers at the Stellantis plant watched the headlines with weary eyes. Weeks earlier, their Jeep Compass production had been moved to Illinois, a decision influenced by U.S. tariff incentives and border politics. Local Mayor Patrick Brown called it a political casualty dressed as an economic decision. Nearly 3,000 families faced layoffs. Yet Carney's government didn't respond with tariffs or retaliation. Instead, they accelerated domestic retooling funds, partnered with European EV firms, and expanded Canada's Battery Corridor initiative from Ontario to Quebec. That was the first sign of the Canadian playbook. Outlast, outbuild, outposition. Inside U.S. talk shows, Trump's allies praised his toughness, arguing that tariffs would bring back real jobs. But in the Midwest, factory managers were warning senators that costs for raw materials were up by double digits. American car makers couldn't build without Canadian aluminum and components. The North American supply chain, once the pride of integrated trade, was showing fractures. Meanwhile, the No Kings protests grew. Commentators compared them to the 1960s anti-war marches, not for their size, but for their symbolism. "It's a rejection of chaos," one analyst told Bloomberg. "It's about economic exhaustion as much as politics." In a strange way, these protests were global. Workers in Detroit, Toronto, and even Mexico's auto belt were connected by the same anxiety. Unpredictability had replaced stability as the new norm. Canada understood that instability was America's new weakness. Rather than matching Trump's bravado, Carney doubled down on diplomacy. He reached out to Seoul to fast-track a trade facilitation deal, reopened talks with Brussels over green tech partnerships, and signed new mineral supply MOUs with Australia and Chile. When questioned in Parliament about whether Canada was too soft on the United States, Carney replied evenly, "Restraint is not weakness. It's leverage over time." The numbers began to support him. Exports to Asia climbed 11% year over year. European investment in Canadian renewables spiked 22%. And within North America, the narrative was shifting. For international firms wary of volatility in Washington, Canada looked like the safe bet. While the US dollar whipsawed through political noise, the Canadian dollar held steady. Global capital, from energy funds to automotive investors, began flowing north. A JP Morgan analyst called it the resilience trade. Still, not everyone in Canada agreed with Carney's approach. Opposition leader Pierre Poilievre argued that the government's calm was complacency in disguise. In fiery parliamentary debates, he accused Carney of failing to defend Canadian workers aggressively enough. But Carney's supporters countered that retaliation would only fuel the very instability Canada was trying to avoid. "We win by being the adult in the room," one Liberal MP said. Across the border, Trump doubled down. He dismissed the No Kings protests as fake and accused globalist bankers of undermining his economic agenda. But the rhetoric didn't change the data. Manufacturing output in several swing states had fallen for 3 consecutive quarters. Inflation, which had briefly cooled, was again rising due to supply disruptions. And in the background, foreign investors were quietly diversifying out of US assets toward Canada, the EU, and parts of Asia. In Toronto's financial district, the mood was cautious but confident. "We're in a new era of economic geopolitics," said a senior banker at TD Securities. Canada's strategy is basically to weaponize stability. And it seemed to be working. Even as US tariffs expanded, Canadian businesses were adjusting faster. Mining firms secured long-term export contracts with Japan and Germany. EV component makers in Ontario began supplying European brands. The government's $400 million Green Supply Chain Guarantee program helped absorb early losses. By the time Trump threatened more tariffs if Canada doesn't play ball, the math had changed. Canada had already diversified nearly 40% of its trade growth outside North America. Still, none of this erased the human pain. In Windsor, small suppliers who once sold exclusively to US factories were closing. In Alberta, farmers faced retaliatory tariffs on canola. And in Quebec, tourism saw declines as US visitors tightened spending. But for every closure, Ottawa launched new adjustment grants and industry transition programs. Slow, bureaucratic, but real. Meanwhile, the protest scenes in America kept looping on news channels. The No Kings chant echoed beyond politics. It became a symbol of fatigue with spectacle. For Canadian observers, it was both a warning and a validation. The contrast was now visible from space. One country on fire with slogans, another quietly recalibrating its economy. Back in Washington, Trump's advisors were alarmed by a different kind of data: polling. Surveys showed that while tariffs had strong symbolic support, most Americans now blamed them for higher prices. In rural states, farmers were losing patience. "We can't export to China. We can't import from Canada. What are we supposed to do?" one Iowa farmer asked in a local interview. The global press began calling it the Trade Cold War. And in this new Cold War, Canada was winning quietly, not with weapons or rallies, but with policy discipline. When Carney attended a G7 summit in Brussels, journalists noticed the shift in tone. While Trump's delegation emphasized America first, Carney's speech framed interdependence as sovereignty. It was, in effect, a new doctrine, one that blended national interest with global integration. Underneath all the numbers and statements lay a philosophical divide. Trump's politics thrived on confrontation. Carney's approach depended on patience. And for a global economy shaken by uncertainty, patience was now the rarest commodity. Industry by industry, the effects unfolded. In autos, the Stellantis shift symbolized the immediate pain of border tensions. In steel, Canadian mills leveraged tariff exemptions to redirect exports toward Europe. In energy, Alberta's producers found eager buyers in Asian refineries through new pipeline routes. And in critical minerals, from lithium to copper, Canada was rapidly positioning itself as the democratic world's supplier of choice. At the same time, the US found itself increasingly isolated in trade forums. The European Commission, while still allied politically, criticized the weaponization of tariffs. Asian economies that once looked to Washington for leadership were deepening ties with Canada and the EU. In one memorable moment, a CNBC anchor summarized it perfectly. The US is fighting for dominance. Canada is fighting for stability. And stability is winning. Domestically, Canada's balance wasn't perfect. Inflation still stung. Housing costs remained a crisis. But the trade strategy was proving resilient. By mid-year, Canadian exports had recovered from tariff shocks, while the US faced supply shortages in automotive chips, aluminum, and even processed fertilizer, all industries once reliant on smooth cross-border trade. Trump's team sought to reframe the narrative. They accused Canada of economic freeloading, alleging unfair subsidies. But global investors weren't listening. When the World Bank released its annual stability index, Canada had climbed 3 ranks. The US had fallen 2. Back in Brampton, the laid-off Stellantis workers were still looking for certainty. Some found jobs in new battery startups supported by federal grants. Others retrained in renewable tech. The transition was uneven but visible. A slow replacement of dependency with reinvention. And that's where the story really leaves us, standing between 2 very different futures. One, driven by noise, power, and ego. The other, built on patience, balance, and quiet strength. As the US wrestles with its own divisions, Canada isn't shouting. It's simply building trade routes, partnerships, and trust. Maybe that's what real leadership looks like in this new era. Not dominance, but endurance. And as the No Kings movement echoes across borders, it's clear. The world is watching who learns and who repeats history.